You probably have heard a common claim made by new atheists, which is that religious people are more biased and more dogmatic, and that they themselves as skeptics lack biases, dogmatic beliefs, and will believe in God if just given enough evidence.
Well, I am not biased, and you can test that.
We are atheists that you can observe that do not dogmatically follow anything. Can I speak for you on that,
science? No,
yeah.
Science has got its flaws for sure.
We absolutely
The Catholic
disagree
method has its flaws.
Yeah.
But they're much worse.
Agreed.
I think the reason I'm here is not to try and convert anybody. I'd be incredibly excited by the prospect of being turned into a Christian today.
Well, let's see what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I am
the show's
perfectly
out.
willing. I'm absolutely willing if evidence is put to me.
Right.
There are countless things that I believe, and I believe them based on evidence. And for somebody to accuse me of not caring about evidence, when it's clear that I do believe things and I believe them based on evidence, and I'm willing to accept things, including your attestation for the spear being a common part or a standard part of crucifixion process, I'm willing to take you at your word for that, because the claim is not extraordinary. It is extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence.
Since many new atheists constantly say they just follow the evidence, lack dogmatism, biases, and will change their mind if just given enough evidence, this implies they're a unique group within the human species, as numerous studies show humans are very biased and do not just change their minds when given new evidence. But are skeptics, secularists, or atheists really this unique and lack biases, unlike the rest of us? Does the scientific research actually support this? Let's remember one important fact. The fact that many atheists report that they are less biased and dogmatic is pretty meaningless, because one of the most interesting findings in social psychology is that every single social group in the United States, on average, believes they are less biased than others. Airline passengers believe they are less biased than other travelers. College students believe they are less biased than other college students. And the average American believes he or she is less biased than the average American. So if we only go on self-reported bias, we quickly come to the realization that every group in America, fringe or mainstream, believes themselves to be the beacon of unbiased, rational inquiry. So when many atheists claim they are not biased, they're just showing us they behave and think just like the average person. But what about intelligence? Does being more intelligent remove bias? Some atheists claim to be more intelligent than the average person, or more intelligent than religious individuals. So perhaps they are objectively less biased, by virtue of possessing higher levels of intelligence. Well, we addressed this in more detail in a prior video. But even if we are wrong and atheists are naturally more intelligent, one study has shown that people with higher intelligence do not differ from people with lower intelligence in the probability of possessing 6 out of 7 possible cognitive biases. In other words, people higher in cognitive ability do not at all display lower levels of confirmation bias or other cognitive biases. In fact, going beyond this, despite on average not being statistically different than people of lower IQ, high IQ people are more likely to display an extra bias, called the bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is when people harbor cognitive biases to the same degree as everyone else, but ironically believe themselves to be more immune. To quote, more cognitively sophisticated participants showed larger bias blind spots. This somewhat surprising finding extended to 6 of the 7 biases. So if it is true atheists are more intelligent than religious individuals, then according to this research, they are more likely to have stronger biases in decision-making and forming beliefs. Next, as the clips we pulled earlier show, some atheists like to suggest they are less biased than their religious peers. However, another study demonstrated if you believe you are less biased than your peers or the people around you, that unconsciously you are more likely to believe your judgments and decisions are less in need of correction. To quote, when people are unaware of their bias, they are unlikely to adopt corrective strategies to avoid the sources of bias that influence their judgment. Consequently, people who are more susceptible to bias blind spot are less prone to improve their decision-making by engaging in bias reduction strategies, responding to training, and taking advice. Consequently, they may need more persuasion or evidence that their decision-making is subject to error to acknowledge their potential for bias. So if you don't think you suffer from biases, then you very well could become a more biased person, and less likely to take advice or criticism from people who have a different viewpoint than you. So if some atheists think they are less biased or dogmatic, that belief could unconsciously make them more biased and less open to criticism of their beliefs. Going beyond this, some studies have looked at atheists directly. In 2017, researchers studied dogmatic tendencies in atheists directly within 3 countries. The data showed that in self-reported measures, atheists and agnostics claimed to be less dogmatic. But the opposite was found when subjects were directly studied. In fact, Christians were significantly higher than atheists in self-reported dogmatism. However, atheists were higher than Christians on the intolerance of contradictions, my-side bias in arguments, and my-side bias in conviction. To be clear, my-side bias occurs when people evaluate evidence, generate evidence, or test hypotheses in a manner biased towards their own prior opinions and attitudes. So within the study, Christians were slightly more open to admitting dogmatic tendencies than atheists. However, when directly studied, atheists displayed higher levels of my-side bias and intolerance of contradictions, demonstrating that although they can report lower levels of dogmatism, that doesn't actually manifest in their beliefs and actions. Before this, in 2014, it was found that anti-theist subjects scored higher in dogmatism, narcissism, anger inventory, and neuroticism than any other type of non-believer. And the study defined anti-theists as new atheists, and that the assertive anti-theist both proactively and aggressively asserts their views towards others when appropriate, seeking to educate the theists in the passé nature of belief and theology. In other words, anti-theists view religion as ignorance and see any individual or institution associated with it as backward and socially detrimental. The anti-theist has a clear and, in their view, superior understanding of the limitations and danger of religions. And this fits the description of many online atheist activists we tend to run into. Thus, the research shows atheists can be just as biased as theists, and might even be more dogmatic and biased at times, demonstrating that when atheists claim they will just change their mind if given the evidence, this probably is not true, and they are just as prone to reject evidence that doesn't fit their preconceived notions about reality. This should be expected, as atheists are also human, and not more rational or reasonable just because they don't believe in God. Their beliefs about God's non-existence can stem from emotional responses, and not purely logical arguments or lack of evidence. This has been shown in other research. Several studies have reported that non-believers cite emotional reasons for rejecting belief in God, and can involve insecure adult attachments, entitlement, and trait anger. Of course, they also reported the emotional reasons for non-belief were less important than their intellectual reasons. But given the research we already went over, this would be expected, as humans tend to be unaware of their own underlying biases. But generally, the claim made by many atheists that their rejection of belief in God stems from purely logical reasons is also not supported by the data. Finally, what about instances where atheists have attempted to show that theists display specific irrational cognitive faculties, which make them likely to believe in God? Many atheists have asserted that theism may be correlated to a phenomenon called hyperactive agency detection. This is a tendency by some to see agency in places where it is not, like assuming a rustle in the bush is due to a predator as opposed to the wind, seeing a face in nature, or attributing your life circumstances to the actions of divine beings, rather than to chance or impersonal natural forces. Atheists have speculated for years that belief in God may have resulted from a hyperactive agency detection, that early humans saw agency in everything as a way to enhance survival, and this cognitive disposition towards seeing patterns somehow went awry, with the belief in all sorts of gods as a result. However, it is not like scientists have been idle about this question. Numerous studies have been performed and have found no evidence traditional beliefs about God correlate to finding patterns in random noise. One study found that pareidolia, or seeing patterns in randomness, correlates with New Age beliefs such as astrology, tarot reading, channeling, and energy healing, but not traditional theistic beliefs. Then a recent review of the research in the journal Nature outright debunks this idea that religion and hyperactive agency detection are related. The idea that we are compelled to see supernatural agents because we possess an innate perceptual hyperactive agency detection device has been tested and disconfirmed across various experiments. Finally, another study focused more on paranormal believers, but it also suggested there is no evidence hyperactive agency detection correlates to traditional theistic beliefs. However, it did find that low agency detection correlated with skeptics within the study. Now, it's a little speculative, but perhaps the reason skeptics are not convinced by the evidence for theism is not because it is insufficient or erroneous, but perhaps they are just not seeing agency where it actually is. Now, to be fair, I don't think this data proves atheists are naturally more biased than theists. Numerous factors weigh in for each individual, like education, past experiences, maturity level, etc. Beliefs in all people are formed by a mix of emotional and intellectual reasons, and some atheists do admit this and do not pretend they are purely intellectual organisms. But the constant assertions by several other atheists that they are just not biased, or they only care about the evidence, or that they are more rational or skeptical than people who are religious are just a bunch of unscientific, unreasonable, dogmatic, unsupported claims. There is no evidence to support the idea atheists are more rational or reasonable, regardless of how often they paint this picture to the rest of us. So if you don't believe in God, the honest thing to do is to admit the reason is probably not just a lack of evidence, or that you will just change your mind if given enough evidence, as we so often hear.
I'm perfectly happy to accept a miracle if there's evidence for it.
The atheist is simply saying, as Carl Sagan did, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If ever there were an antidote to dogmatism, this is it.
Basically, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So it would take extraordinary evidence to convince me, because so far as I've observed, the universe does indeed play in under the rubric of naturalism.
Unlike you, I am free to change my mind if the evidence compels me to do so, or if I find that it fails to adequately support whatever I shouldn't believe already.
If you have good evidence, I'm good for it, but I'm evidence-driven.
You need evidence.
More
You're a
than
scientist.
I'm faith-driven.
Yeah.
But, in general, I need some evidence. And what Christians tend to offer are anecdotes, not evidence.
Thus, in conclusion, the next time an atheist, secularist, or skeptic says they are not biased and they will just believe God exists if given enough evidence, we should probably apply the principles of skepticism to this positive claim they have made. And note evidence shows this is probably not true, and they are probably just as dogmatic and biased as the average person.